Revolt. I'm a Marxist-Leninist truck driver, Dust James of Anti-Imperialist America, and I'm very glad to have with me my close comrade, host of Working Class Australia, David Fox. How are you tonight, man?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. We've just been going for a bit of heat wave here through southeastern Australia. It's having over 40 degrees today here in Bendigo, but I'm doing quite well. I've one more week to go. I'm back to work following Monday. And yeah, how are you going?
All right, man. I'm switching jobs again. Damn health insurance. It sucks here in the U.S. That's about all I got to say on that. Or maybe I'll get in the labor update, and everybody can see. We have a guest, a very special and honored guest co-host with us, Jay Tharappel. How are you today, sir? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for bringing me into this fold, David. So I'm a PhD student. I'm currently looking at theories of imperialism, because I wanted to understand the wars of the 21st century, which is how I got involved in activism, particularly in opposition to the proxy war against Syria. And then after that, I started talking more about the war on Yemen. So that's basically what I cover. I do consider myself to be a communist, but with some important criticisms of Marxism as well.
Right on, man. That's a lot. That's a mouthful, ain't it, man? You doing good. Let's go into this. So we host this like a regular down home nuts and bolts communist work meeting. No frill, not a lot of thrills going on. And first we start with a labor update. Actually, before we do a labor update, didn't you have a special announcement, Comrade Fox?
Yes, all the comrades around the world and that will be tuning in. Tomorrow we have a global day of action. It's alive. It's no war on Yemen. Actually, one of the speakers is actually Jay Tharappel. He's going to be on there. Apologies, we didn't put the link below, but you can easily find that either on the events pages in Facebook. I just suggest just click on events. You'll find that. It's a global day of solidarity. I believe it will be. Is it 6 o'clock our time tomorrow, Jay?
Yes, it is. That's right. But then there's also one that's the following day, our time at like 4 a.m. and that's the one that the Workers' Party of Britain is running.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So there's obviously one or two there. It'd be I would highly recommend if everyone jump on Facebook, go to the events icon, click on that, and you will find it all through there. Follow the links through. It's obviously a very important issue, and we'll touch on what's going on about Yemen at the moment too. Moving on.
Sure.
Right on, man. I just heard about this event, and I am very glad to hear about it. I mean, like I know my position is that imperialism is the main enemy we face today. That's the global political economic system. And it's the same system that keeps folks down here in the United States, doesn't give us the health care we need, denies us our wages. That is the very same system that is bombing the folks in Yemen, that destroyed Libya, bombing the folks in Iraq and Afghanistan, the same push for power from the oligarchs, banking and oil oligarchs. And it's great to hear the folks standing up against that. And it really ties into what we're doing here. So we'll just get right into the labor update. Brother Fox, maybe you can give us a brief few sentences on how your work's been this last week.
Well, I've been on leave. I think it's an important dispute that's arisen. It's now with Peter's Ice Cream. They're a major manufacturing and the dairy side of things once again. They're based in southeast Melbourne. Now, the company is proposing to slash the wages for casual workers at $9 an hour. So up to 9 hours. So happen to be casual and obviously flowing onto the full-time workforce as well. What the thing is, the productivity is up. They're earning multi-million dollars, up $1 billion last year. I haven't got the exact figure on that, but their productivity and profit's still rising. But the thing is, they have a very insecure workforce. But now they're turned around in order to actually extract more profit from the workforce, or less reduce the wages of the casualised workforce of $9 an hour. The company, actually interesting, in a little note, the company is currently being sued by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission for preventing competition. Now, what that entails, don't ask me yet. I do need to find out a little bit more research on that. But obviously, Peter's Ice Cream, it might be a household name and people like it for those of us here in Australia. But the fact is, it's also to a ruthless multinational that will obviously drive its workforce into the ground to increase its profit margins. This is typical capitalism 101. There's an indefinite ban on overtime at the moment by the workforce, but looking to further expand into indefinite stoppages or part stoppages. I'll try, if I get more information from its union, the United Workers Union, obviously further on, but we will put the call out via social media and other links we've got for support for those workers. Obviously now, today, especially now these days, we need to have more solidarity and more working class solidarity on the ground to support each other, not just in wages and conditions issues, but a bigger struggle ahead.
Right on, man. Always good to hear folks on the ground using the struggle for workers' power as a training school for the revolution. Great to hear about your work and have you as a co-host on here. As far as myself, like I said, I just changed jobs because I had I was at a small health company. There's no universal health care here. And you gotta, that's something you gotta look at when you're in the U.S. So I went to a job and they were paying me pretty decent, but the health insurance was like 4 or 5 times it was at another company. So when you do it all to math, even though, they paid more, it paid less because the health insurance was so expensive. So, I mean, that's something you got to do when you're shopping for jobs. And, I didn't do it right. And I ended up having to change jobs, causing a brief lapse in healthcare for me and my family. So if something was going to go down, I could be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt. And healthcare in the United States is the leading cause of bankruptcy. And it's a major issue, and it needs to change. So Jay, you want to tell us a little bit, give us a labor update. Labor update can mean you personally or the conditions faced by your community.
Sure. I mean, me personally, I'm a PhD student, so I don't think there's anything radical going on there. But if you'd like to shift the focus over to India, which is an area that I know a little bit more about, I'm happy to go there.
Mm-hmm.
For labor update. If you said you were raised in Australia.
Raised in Australia, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Indian background, and David contacted me the other day, and he said, "Would you like to maybe talk about the unrest in India?" So, to the extent that I have anything to contribute on labor, it's probably there.
Right.
Oh, maybe
Okay.
maybe we could save that for the interview portion.
Right. Okay.
And when we're talking about India specifically, can you tell us a little bit about how it is and being an immigrant in Australia? Maybe some of the economic conditions your family had to face, or maybe the larger immigrant community.
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I do come from a fairly middle class kind of family. My parents both came as, skilled workers, engineers. And so, to be perfectly honest, one of the issues that I've noticed with my own community is there is a lack of radicalism when they come to Australia. And that's largely because by the standards of a third world country, Australia is a bit of an upgrade, So I think that's a problem that we have in Australia, which is that because we have a lot of people coming from other countries that are worse than Australia, they perceive Australia as being better than where they came from, and that, of course, creates the conditions for undermining labor struggles here. And I say that as a brown person, So I think we just have to be brutally honest sometimes about these issues. That being said, I do think that as immigrant communities come to Australia and they become integrated, and then the next generation comes up, And of course, the second generation of any immigrant community, they don't have the same sense of kind of subservience towards the new country as their parents did, and so they start to get more radical. They have this audacity of equality, to say, look, I am just like everyone else. We're all in the same boat, and so I think that's probably the way that immigrant Australia is heading as well.
Wow, that's good insight, man. I guess we'll go. Let's see, I did my update. David is an update. All right, we're done with the labor updates. Let's move on to the news portion. I don't have. Let's see. Let's save the inauguration for next. That was a big news item. You had something going down there in Australia with Rupert Murdoch and Google. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, Fox.
Well, it's quite an interesting state of affairs because this is all what's happened. The Australian government, the federal government, is putting legislation to Parliament about basically for social media to negotiate terms to pay vast media companies such as Murdoch's empire and that to advertise their news. Now, there's a lot of in the background, there's a lot happening, and that's mainly there's a war between not a war, but there's an actual clash between the factions in the ruling class. You have Murdoch's media empire and many other media moguls behind him. Then you have the tech giants, the social media, the Silicon Valley on the other side. And Murdoch is actually a very big backer of the Liberal Party here in Australia. They obviously give him a lot of free airtime on his Sky News, which is equivalent to your Fox News in the US there. They've actually very big influences on federal elections. And Murdoch himself, his empire owns over 70% of the media here in Australia, which is really a lot of things in questions now. What's happened, the federal government on his behest is, they said, wants to have legislation in place that will force Google and Facebook, the main players in the social media, but there's many others there, to negotiate terms with Murdoch and many others to for them to pay these media companies money to put their news on their search engines, etc. Now, on that, Murdoch's actual newspapers in sales and profitability has actually been on the decline for many years. If in fact, if you go into a supermarket and news agents on a street stall, etc., I mean, there's literally piles of the Murdoch's paper in Sydney. It's the Daily, the Smelly Telly, the Telegraph. In Melbourne here, it's Herald Sun, otherwise known as the Herald Scum. They can't even give it away. They just pile up. That's how bad it is. And a lot of people have actually thrown their subscriptions to Sky News and Fox News as well. And especially when you've got elderly people, or older people that either passed on or moving on, usually the younger generation say, well, we're going to cancel the subscription. They're trying to say, well, do you want the subscription? The answer is no. And we will access our news, everyone else. Because a lot of people are accessing their news from other alternative source sectors. So Murdoch's got a concern here. His profit margins have been affected. So obviously on the phone to the federal parliament, you must do something. And this is what's happening here. And obviously there's no love between Silicon Valley and the Murdoch empire either. There might be mutual cooperation at times, for advertising, but really this is where you're seeing the clashes with the factions of the ruling class. What the big concern is for working class people, or maybe people with small businesses, self-employed, and farmers who tend to use Google service. And I'll just back up there for that. I mean, Google has threatened to disable the search engine here in Australia, and possibly it leads up to the questions all its other services such as Gmail, YouTube, GPS, or Google Maps and GPS tracking. Very important. Farmers use GPS tracking, and many others that work in regional remote areas. And that, so a lot of businesses and even unions too use Google or some forms of Google services for them for the function of their systems, and so do generally a lot of working class families who may have Gmail accounts or may use it for other information like applying for work and that. But the thing is, there's been no talk about that at all. It's been basically Google's to say, well, look, we'll threaten to turn off the search provider if you go ahead with that. And obviously at the moment they're advertising through it. If you can just go on their search engine or just type Google in, Google News, and they'll bring that up. And they've got the CEO of Australia to explain why would they do that as well, and saying how much bad this legislation is. Now, what's interesting, there's a lot of discussion. I've read some notices there on Facebook and other areas, and some people, goodbye Google and don't come back. Great. But I think we just got to pull up a bit there and see what's actually happening around, because these two fights between those factions, how's it going to affect working class people overall? I know some people saying, we should use DuckDuckGo and other search engines, but if you have a system all tied up using the Google side of things, that's going to cause major disruptions, especially if they decide to close down all the rest of their services here in Australia. That will leave us sort of blacked out or switched off from the rest of the world for a bit while everyone's trying to readjust and that. So it's certainly, I'm not saying we should side with Google and side with Murdoch. I mean, as far as I wish the Murdoch empire would disappear. It's a disgraceful media source. I don't regard it as media. I just call it complete garbage. But the reality is, in the end of the day as well, but how's it going to affect working class people moving forward, and also general people where working families and small business owners, people are self-employed, farmers, etc. What's the adverse effect that's going to happen there? And I think these are the concerns we should need to rally around. But also the question is now it's about the complete absolute control of both the social or the tech giants in Silicon Valley and the media as well. Who controls it? AKA the capitalist class. In the information we get through, it's just their world opinion or world views, not any working class. So it's something that just worthwhile always keep and consider about. I understand the sentiment behind it. It could be goodbye to Google. Look how much control they had. Especially just recently in relation to what happened at Capitol Hill early this month, where social media was just shutting down pages and kicking people off social media, and also Google's role behind that as well. I get that. I actually do get that, but it's just I think we really need to develop a good strategy around this as well, how we would campaign effectively with this. So I just wanted to get everyone updated about that. I think it's something worthwhile always keeping in the back of our minds. I know a lot of comrades, even myself, have used starting up alternate social media apps, and etc., which is VK, Signal, Telegram. That is a sort of a backup plan if something does happen. But also too, now it's like, I know a few people are talking about setting up different email accounts with other app providers in case something happens to go horribly south. So I'll just put that out there, and that's where that's at the moment. It's saying the whole world's watching Australia at the moment. I believe it was more or less Murdoch was just onto the phone to the Morrison government, do something. So they say, yes, sir, no, yes, sir, 3 ways. Sir, we'll put something in place. So we'll just say as this pans out over the next few weeks will be interesting. I mean, fingers crossed it won't have any much of adverse effects on us here in Australia, but then again, but at the same time, look, we've just got to be a little bit careful of what we wish for at times as well. I mean, obviously, I know, as I said, I understand everyone's sentiments and everything else, but just we've got to be a little bit more strategic and just have think things through clearly about this. Thank you.
Right on, man. Oh, there's an echo. All right. No, it's fine. I think I'm gonna just break it down. So I'm a truck driver, and I like to get things real easy and coming to me. I'll just re-summarize for the guests, kind of, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on this. From my understanding, and you shared a good video from Jason Unruhe, I believe his name was. You shared me that video that he did on it, and I also recently read Matt Cedillo. Actually shared an BBC article.
Yes, I read it.
So it was making the rounds in several different circles. And from my understanding, Google's constantly collecting information. We're using Google. We're using Facebook and Google right now, and just so we don't get shut down, they are authorized to take that information, blop, etc. But they collect tons and tons of information from us. They know where we are when we use their location services. They have the emails. They have all this stuff. And apparently Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News and owns almost all of Australian, if I understand, owns basically a large portion of Australian.
70%. Yeah.
said he wanted that information from Google. And then Google was like, I think they're saying no. Google said no. And Rupert Murdoch's like, well, you can't do business in Australia. Now, first of all, how does this corporate news giant have this much control over what's supposed to be a democratic sovereign government? Number one is one of my concerns, and that's quite a bit of drama. Does that sum it up well?
I think it's a good question. I mean, like, if you look at Australia's history, Australia's got a long record of being subverted, having its democratic institutions subverted by the United States, beginning with the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. Then, I mean, even Kevin Rudd, I think this is lesser known, that there was a parliamentary kind of coup to get rid of him because they saw him as being too independent. And so I think there is like a feeling, like among certain sections of the Australian working class who are politically conscious, that the United States will not allow Australia to have a competent national leadership. And so you see it in reflected in our news media as well. We have this weird phenomena in Australia where whenever we watch the news, we watch it as if we're a part of the United States. So to give you an example, and I'm sure Dave can jump in here, whenever there's elections in the United States between the two candidates, what every other country in the world does is they ask the question, well, what do these two candidates represent for our country? So if it's India, they'll say, well, who's better for India? In Australia, we just get sucked into the culture wars within the United States as if we're a part of the United States. And so this, I think, has really affected the psychology of a lot of Australians.
That's right. And if you look at it, the cultural side of things, it's how we conduct elections now. To say when I was a young boy, it was completely different. That as well. It's very all US influence type of elections we have here as well, and also too, it's just how they, how we go about things. But yeah, you switch on the 7 o'clock news, ABC, or the 6 o'clock news, be on the other channels. But there'll always be a news item from about the US president, regardless if it was Trump previously or Biden now. There'll be always something there. And actually, when you look at it, most of the news content, a lot of it was about overseas, especially US or something that's US involved, and where it's only very little, partly Australian content, not something adversely affects something the ruling class here. They'll have a big spread about it. It certainly is a huge thing, and and the amount of people that do follow US elections. I mean, we do by default anyway, because we're involved in anti-imperialism, Marxism, and that we would anyway. But just the general people that flick on the news, and it's interesting because even like the last few years when Trump was president, when he got first elected in 2016, the amount of workers talking about it, and I thought, well, you would think that wouldn't adversely affect what is happening here in Australia, but and because our economy is all been entwined with a lot of US multinationals, etc. And also we're part of entwined in US foreign policy, but just how much it has influence here in Australia. And interesting, you mentioned about Rudd and Kevin Rudd. Back in 2008, we had the global financial crisis. As we know, it was a crisis of overproduction. And through that period, and what happens, Rudd was also steering that economy, improving relations with our biggest trading partner at the time, China, which is now all question marks in the air about that at the moment. And US obviously want to have this pivot into Asia. That was a big no-no, and they basically threw the US consulate onto the phones of certain particular figures, both within Parliament and outside it. You've got to do something about this person, and they certainly said yes. And then there was a coup d'etat, parliamentary coup d'etat against him. One day Brad was our Prime Minister, next day he wasn't.
Just wanted to say, I mean, I remember, like, this gives you an idea of, I think, the mentality of the Australian ruling class. 2 years ago, John Mearsheimer, I'm not sure if you're aware of who he is, but he's an American realist thinker, and he's quite influential in pushing hostility towards China. And he basically wants Australia to become an aircraft carrier for the United States, and he's asking Australians to paint targets on our backs. But when he came to Australia, he did so in a very threatening way, So he said, security wise, you really want to go with us, And then he made an implicit threat towards the end of his speech, where he said, he said, some people say there's an alternative. You can go with China. You have a choice here. You can go with China rather than the United States. And by the way, when he says go with China, the bar is actually really, really low. So he says, if you're trading extensively with China and you're friendly with China, you're undermining the United States in the security competition. Therefore, if you go with China, you want to understand that you are our enemy. You are then deciding to be an enemy of the United States. And after this, what totally spun me out was the response of the Australian crowd. They started laughing. They thought it was funny. So that tells you how kind of psychologically colonized we are by the US media, and there's an obvious cultural reason for that. The United States speaks English. We're a part of this Anglophone world, and so that kind of really affects our psychology as a nation.
Yep.
Right on. I think this probably has overlaps with Julian Assange. It's always good to mention the struggle for independent journalists and how they're being suppressed. And we've raised this time and time again. Maybe you just ask Brother Jay here. How does it feel having a fellow Australian citizen being kept in a courtroom and a jail and solitary confinement and being tortured?
I think maybe I speak for a lot of Australians, a lot of progressives, communists alike when I say this, that Julian Assange is one of the few Australians that actually makes me proud to say that I'm an Australian. So if I go overseas, like Australian, like Julian Assange, and I think that's something good, because I think we've got this subservient political attitude in Australia, because I think it goes back to the fact that the way that Australia was founded as a penal colony. And so we don't have a Bill of Rights. And so, we don't really, Australians, I think, have always benefited from all of this gold and soil and wealth for toil. We have this large continent that was stolen from the indigenous population. And so we have these first world living standards, but we never actually developed a political consciousness around a certain set of rights that citizens are entitled to. And you see this with Julian Assange. I mean, it's embarrassing to me that the Ecuadorians protested harder for Julian Assange than the Australian population did, and the diplomatic support that our government has offered Julian Assange, or lack thereof, has been absolutely embarrassing.
Yep. Spot on.
Right on. That's very impassionate words, and that's you raising a lot of issues, from being in immigrant communities to patriotism, third world. Like that was a lot of issues.
Dust, you just cut out there for a sec. Could you just repeat what you just said?
I was just saying you're raising a lot of issues from being an immigrant in a first world country, and then that ideas of patriotism, and we always like to promote revolutionary patriotism. That means like the man behind me, John Brown, I would consider as someone proud is a fellow American. Although America is the leading imperialist in the world, the most disgusting imperialist power in human history, and that we're fighting against. But there's Brother Fox did. He's done some good stuff on this. The idea of revolutionary patriotism. I love how you raise Julian Assange as a revolutionary patriotic figure in Australian that's on the right side of history. Struggling for freedom, justice, and humanity. Let's see. I guess I'll go on to the main news topic that everybody's talking about. You guys have probably put it down each other's throats, and I got an image off of Facebook here that kind of gets my point of it. I don't know if people can see that image, but it's Kamala Harris and her face is, and then Joe Biden. To the left of them, you got prisoners. To the right of that, you got oil. And on top of there, you got warplanes, war helicopters, and drones. And that's essentially what the new administration brings to the world. And it's arguably a more efficient imperialism. it gets certainly a larger portion of the masses are behind this new and coming regime. Trump had his group of supporters, older folks, mostly white folks, and society that no longer really reflects American society. But you have this more diverse, better, well-spoken, more articulate president. Well, he's also senile, but he's no Obama. Obama was like the perfect representation of this very well-spoken. Yeah, for the American empire, and we're seeing that again. The same. It feels a lot like a lot of people said that Trump felt like Nazi Germany, and there was a lot of parallels. I didn't go as far. I wasn't one of those people that said we had to back Joe because Trump was fascist. That wasn't my position. My position was continue to build workers' power, continue to build power within the oppressed nations, and use that to push for better labor conditions, push for healthcare, not lose ourselves in imperialist parties. And I'm very critical of forces like the Squad and Bernie Sanders. I often call them sheepdogs because if you notice, they talk the game about giving us health care. They talk the game about raising the wage. None of this shit ever gets done. And then all they can tell us is vote for these evil warmongers. These people that Joe Biden is an architect of the prison industrial complex, an architect we call the new Jim Crow. This prison system is a way of maintaining class oppression, maintaining national oppression of African American and Chicano brothers and sisters. And now there's a better, more effective helmsman at humanity's main enemy, imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. And there was a lot of pageantry that went on to it. Another picture I got here to go along with what I saw was a lot how it was very Hollywood, how it was very scripted. And I don't know if y'all can see this. This is American pop singer Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga, who's famous for wearing very elaborate outfits. And this is her with a golden microphone and a gold dove. And I thought that was particularly ironic, seeing that our main enemy, imperialism, includes the Australian, the imperialist bloc. I say to a lesser extent Australia, have you guys been saying, but definitely the imperialist bloc, being Europe and led by the United States, is the reason why people live on less than $2 a day. The reason why mass Africa is in chaos and in poverty. The Middle East is in chaos and in poverty. Children have to dig through trash for well-being all over the world, and from Brazil, destruction of the rain. Like this group of oligarchs, mostly in the banking and energy sectors, and to a lesser extent, large-scale manufacturing, are the reason for mass war and chaos. And here we are inaugurating the newest helmsman, the newest commander-in-chief of imperialism. And here she is representing a dove for peace at peak irony. And there's a little bit of funniness to this particular meme. The new Hunger Games looks lit or looks intense. It's almost like fiction representing reality. Like the Hunger Games was a television series and popular book series, and it was about a controlled system where working people were hungry and forced into these like Roman-esque Colosseum games to kill each other. And now, and it makes sense. And I think she kind of looks like, if you look at that Hunger Games, the character they're talking about in particular was like, there was an announcer that kind of dressed like and looked like Lady Gaga that was announcing people literally killing each other. And I love that y'all brought up Yemen. I mean, Yemen is one of the most horrific war crimes in recent history. Genocide, starvation, all caused by the chaos from the Saudi war that's being funded by the U.S. I think U.S. was refueling the warplanes that were bombing the Yemenis people. Maybe I can talk a little bit more on that, but maybe Comrade Jay, if you got anything to add to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, what we've seen over the past few weeks is the blacklisting of Ansarullah by the outgoing administration. It wasn't Trump that directly did it; it was Mike Pompeo. I did some research into the blacklisting, and what I found is that, firstly, Pompeo, he justified blacklisting Ansarullah on the grounds that they were responsible for carrying out this attack in Aden, which is the southern part of Yemen. But before I get into that, I wanted to give you just a basic idea of what's happening in Yemen. There are three claimants to government in Yemen. You have the Houthis, right? Or the Houthi-backed government, or it's probably more accurate to say the National Salvation Government, which is based in the capital of Yemen, Sana'a. And this government is led by the Houthis, and they are a kind of Zaidi Shia political movement, and they've been wanting to take back their country because they believe that ever since the assassination of the Yemeni president back in 1977, his name's Ibrahim al-Hamdi, ever since he was assassinated, Yemen has basically been transformed into a colony of Saudi Arabia. It's been turned into a pool of cheap labor, cheap mercenaries for Saudi Arabia's wars overseas, beginning in Afghanistan in the 1980s. When those Mujahideen mercenaries originally from Yemen returned back to Yemen, they brought Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda militias were then used to terrorize the Yemeni Socialist Party into submission. So hundreds of Yemeni communists were murdered by Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And it's in this context that Ansarullah, the movement that I mentioned before, it's in this context that they emerge. As for the other two claimants to government, they are collaborators. So you have one force calling itself the Hadi government. Hadi is the former president of Yemen, and he resigned. And immediately after he resigned, he went to Saudi Arabia and he said, "I'm still the president of Yemen." And so his so-called government of Yemen is recognized in the international community as the internationally recognized official legitimate government of Yemen, even though its fighting force is something like 83% comprised of foreigners. They're all foreign mercenaries drawn particularly from the Muslim world. And then you've got, and then 3 years after the war, so the war began in 2015. So 2 or 3 years after the war began, there was a separatism from within the Hadi government called the Southern Transitional Council, which then got the backing of the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. And so you have this strange way in which the conflict is covered in the West, where the Ansarullah government, which is 100% indigenous, are referred to as Iranian proxies or Iranian-backed rebels. Whereas the Hadi government is referred to as the legitimate government of Yemen, even though it's completely dominated by a foreign occupying army of mercenaries drawn from across the world. And so there was a bombing in Aden, which Pompeo used to blame on the Ansarullah movement. But if you look closely at the reports that are coming out of Yemen, it's clear that Ansarullah wasn't involved, because the two collaborationist forces, the UAE-backed forces and the Saudi-backed forces, are slaughtering each other. They've been at war with each other for the past 2 or 3 years, and they're accusing each other of carrying out those attacks at Aden airport on the 30th of December that Pompeo used to justify blacklisting Ansarullah. The airport staff themselves have said that this that the surveillance cameras at the airport were removed 2 days before the bombing, suggesting that the entire event was staged, perhaps to give Pompeo the justification that he needed for blacklisting Ansarullah. That being said, to the extent that from a purely anti-imperialist perspective, both sides of the American election were imperialist, but they're imperialist in different ways, and the damage that they do is harsher on different countries, So for the Democrats are actually the lesser evil on Yemen. And that's because, to their credit, some of the more kind of grassroots Democrats have been pushing for an end to the war because they see that it's just an outright genocide. I mean, there is a cynical interpretation, which is that they're doing this as a bargaining chip in order to get the Iranians back onto the nuclear deal. So they're saying, we'll stop slaughtering the Yemenis if you agree to the nuclear deal. And that for the Iranians is a big problem because they ended up having to destroy so much of their indigenous capacity in order to capitulate to the previous nuclear deal. So why should they trust the United States? So it could be just a bargaining tactic, but the Trump administration, the single most evil thing that administration did was to veto the call by the United States Congress for the United States to stop supporting the war on Yemen. And finally, I just wanted to say Australia is involved. So, for example, we were blocking our own aid from reaching Yemen because Australia was helping to train the Saudi Navy to impose the blockade. And Australian weapons companies have also made money from this. So one of them is EOS Systems, I believe. And because the mercenaries, and the reason why these Australian companies make money is because they manufacture really high-tech, sophisticated armored personnel carrier vehicles, with laser-guided, guns mounted on top of them. And the reason they do this is because when you're employing mercenaries, firstly, the mercenaries are expensive. Mercenaries don't want to die. They believe in self-preservation. They're not like the Houthis. They're not like the Yemeni national resistance who are willing to die. And so they fight with small arms, Kalashnikovs, and they walk around in in slippers, and they're still winning. Whereas these mercenaries that are paid by the Saudis, they need all this fancy equipment to keep them alive. And so these Australian arms companies have made a lot of money profiting off the genocide that's being inflicted upon the Yemeni people.
Very good. Yeah. And it's just interesting too. I mean, even to what the Democrats, as Biden there now, it's not to say he's also got a past history along with when he was vice president with Obama, but even previously he's backed for imperialist ventures into war. I think I made this comment once on one of our shows here. It's in Australia we had an old saying once: no one is elected into government, or governments are elected out. And then, because the analysis there, what happened from the leading up from last year's election to the inauguration, and so people didn't vote for Biden because they loved him or they loved the Democrats and anything like that. They just wanted to get rid of Trump. They had enough of it, and so some swung over and went and got organised and backed Biden instead. And through that inauguration, the side's been outright tacky. But the fact is, with Lady Gaga and I think Jennifer Lopez there, it really, to me, if for anyone, it could just see right through the whole smoke screen for what that really is. I'm glad those actually pictures were created, one with the drones and the planes, etc., because it's certainly where they're going to be intensifying attacks. It's led to believe there's news is Biden's increasing troops back into Syria again, which is a very big concern as well. And obviously, there's going to be other adventures as well. And what's going to happen with China as well? Will he intensify relations there further or improve relations? I think relations will be intensified further. Because basically, what I'm looking at the US as well, it's got nowhere else to go anymore. It really hasn't. So, and it knows it's on the verge of just complete collapse. So it needs to start looking at proxy wars. And also, too, it's interesting, Caleb did a talk about this morning about what was happening in Russia, about, what's his name, Navalny, I think it is. And just explain and explain what his role really is. And, it says when there's only a tiny microscopic percentage of the population supporting him, but the role of the Western media is involved in that, well, the United States, they're going to be trying to cause, I think, a lot more. They're going to try and use the instability, little softer approach, CIA method of doing things, but they'll still have a base set of troops in other countries, and then they'll try to further expand proxy wars everywhere.
Can I just say, you mentioned that Biden has it that the United States has already started to put troops back into Syria. This is actually one of those situations in which Trump actually tried to do the right thing. He tried to pull out of Syria twice, and on those two occasions that he tried, the opposition came not just from the Democrats but also from sections of the left, because the left was saying we have to stay in Syria in order to protect the YPG, the Rojava movement and everything like that, which is just a fig leaf for supporting the occupation of another country. I mean, good luck to the YPG, but we should not be occupying another country. I mean, that's between them. That's between Syrians to work out for themselves. But we should not be there, because what we've done is we've turned northern Syria into a base of operations for aggression. And so, unfortunately, the YPG are, if you look at it from the perspective of the rest of the Syrian population, I mean, they have allowed a foreign power to occupy Syrian territory, which is then used to carry out aggression against Iraq, against Syria. And so we should not be complicit in this, but a lot of leftists, unfortunately, went along with it.
Yes, yep. Trying to agree there.
Right on. That was a great thing to raise. I always bring up, folks look out for Nick. He got a page called Flame of Liberation, and he did a very good presentation on the Ba'athist Party, both in Iraq and in Syria, and a lot of stuff, outside of anti-imperialist discussions, you won't hear about the positive things the Assad government has done as far as creating stability, about creating a level of moderate prosperity compared to other regions at the same development, or the same countries in the same region. Aren't as developed, and they've been able to help the people out and raise standards of livings. And all you hear in the United States, Assad is evil. Anybody that talks to Assad is evil. Tulsi Gabbard, which was more of an anti-interventionist, I wouldn't call her an anti-imperialist. She was part of the military and proud of being part of the military, but she actually would talk with Assad. And then she got called. She was told by Hillary Clinton that she was working for Russia and all this, and she was completely took out of the conversation. And I had issues. The one party I support is the Green Party, because it's the biggest left party that I consider not to be imperialist. And they actually took the position you said. They said they supported the YPG and the Kurdish folks, and they wanted the troops to stay there. And that was one of the very big differences. Now, it wasn't everybody in the Green Party. There was just certain segments of it that I really disagreed with on that. And I think that was a great thing to raise. And that's a line. There's a line between being a liberal and being a revolutionary and anti-imperialist. And, Fred Hampton, I am the people, not the pig. I am a revolutionary. And siding with the empire. And is being a pig, is going against our interest. And that's going against the interest of the working class. We got the same enemies, the working class. If you're out there supporting the intervention, destruction of Syria, you are out there supporting the brutal treatment of African-American brothers and sisters, and you're supporting the repression of your own working class community.
Absolutely. I've got something to say, by the way, just about, you mentioned, Nick Maniaci and his channel, and how they've been talking about the achievements of Ba'athist governments, both in Iraq and Syria. I think one of the major pillars of Western hegemony, particularly the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these countries in particular, is this idea of Western exceptionalism, which is that our country, our system, is superior to every other country in the world. And this, I think, has tainted much of the left with the same impression. But the left-wing mentality is one of saying, all of these other countries in the world, they're ruled. There's only two types of people that live in these countries. You've got tyrants who are doing the oppressing, and then you've got victims who need to be saved by us. So it's this savior complex. So in many ways, the white guilt that you see, like on the left, is also actually serves an imperialist function, because when you need to overthrow the government of another country, you simply say, well, we have to save the people of that country from their own government or from another government or whatever. And so that actually becomes a way of justifying aggression.
Yep.
Right on. So I guess that'll do it for our news portion. Let's go into the interview portion. David Fox, can you chair this section?
Yeah, certainly. Well, look, once again, welcome back, welcome aboard, and it's a pleasure having you on this show. And obviously, I've met you a couple of times myself when I've been in Sydney and spoken to you on the phone a few times. And obviously, that was through subjects such as Syria, through the Syria issue. But just before we go ahead, I just want to ask, look, can you give us a background about yourself? I know you just briefly did at the start of the show, but just a little bit more further detail.
I'm currently a PhD student. I hope to finish sometime this year. I'm looking at imperialism and war. So the theories of imperialism, so that we properly understand what it is. And I've been involved in activism for the past decade or so, beginning with the war in Syria, where I decided to side with the government, because I thought that was the position that the left should take, and that I was of the opinion that the left had taken the wrong position on Syria, the vast majority. And so from Syria, Yemen, I think was the natural progression of that when that war began in 2015. So those have been my two major areas of interest and concern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also too, it's interesting because I noticed that when you're studying imperialism, we've mentioned before on this show, a lot of people tend to use the term very loosely. Understand what they might be saying they're for something, but they're anti-imperialist, but they're actually taking a wrong position. For example, if someone will say, "Oh, well, I'm anti-fascist," but then they attack us, they're anti-imperialist. Do you find that actually quite common when you in your dealings with people?
Yeah. And, part of the reason is because the word has never really been unified in terms of its conclusions. And it goes back to World War I, because this is a World War I era concept, and we have to recognize that comes with certain implications. So if you look at the map of the world in World War I, what you would see is that it's dominated by a handful of empires. Literally 8 empires control the entire planet. Mm-hmm. And so in the context of World War I, the reason why the cry of the charge of imperialism was raised was because you had the working classes of each empire, particularly in Europe, basically saying, we're being dragged into these wars with each other, so we need to turn the war between nations into a war between classes. That's the basic position, right? So you overthrow your government and have socialism, we'll overthrow our government and have socialism, therefore we wouldn't have to fight these meaningless wars. There you go, like international socialism achieved, right? And that was basically the kind of mode of thinking. Obviously, I've simplified it, but I simplified for the purposes of looking back in history and understanding that particular period in its own context. The problem is that their understanding of imperialism did not fully appreciate underdevelopment. That is how nations exploit each other. They built their model of imperialism by taking the model of capitalism. And so within capitalism, you have this dialectic of classes, right? Class exploitation, workers versus capitalists. And then they multiplied this model to have multiple capitalisms. And all these multiple capitalisms are competing with each other, and they go to war with each other. Okay, so that's the idea of imperialism, but there's no national exploitation. So how do nations exploit each other? And this is where I believe the contributions of Indian political economy are actually quite important. So Prabhat Patnaik and Utsa Patnaik are two very important Indian Marxists. They've definitely influenced me. So Prabhat Patnaik says that imperialism is immanent in the money form. So it's money and currency that actually underpins the mechanism by which countries exploit other countries, right? So India is actually central to this, because during World War I, which country was the hegemon? It was Britain. Britain was the preeminent hegemon. And but we never actually asked the question, what was the basis of British hegemony? And the basis of British hegemony was India. 70% of the population of the British Empire were Indians. So these are my ancestors. But unfortunately, what happened to India never actually filtered into the Western Marxist understanding of imperialism. So what happened is that from 1765 to 1935, so during this period, so India was colonized, was under the control of the British. Actually, it's a little bit wider than that. So 1757 to 1947. In this period, between 1/3 and 1/4 of the taxes that was raised from the Indian population was set aside to buy goods from India. So this is a one-way transfer of wealth. Okay,
Mhm.
this is very important to understand, because if you're an Indian peasant and you're paying taxes to one person, and then that person then uses those taxes to buy your goods, you don't perceive it as being a one-way exchange, but actually it is. So on aggregate, India lost $45 trillion by this process of one-way transfer from India to Britain. And this one-way transfer is what allowed Britain to export capital to build countries like Australia. Now, that's, of course, important for Indian Australians living here, because if we ever face racism, people saying, you don't belong here or whatever, what have you done for this country? We say, well, $45 trillion from India helped to build Australia. I mean, obviously, Australia is a resource-rich continent in its own right. It's just that Indians were only allowed to immigrate to this country from 1972 onwards, right? And if the patterns of immigration that Britain was able to export large numbers of its population to the Americas, Canada, Australia. India, however, was paying for the empire, was exporting all of these surpluses and enriching Britain. But Indians were never given the same right of emigration, because there was two streams of migration in this period. You had like the tropical stream, so Indians would go to Fiji, to the West Indies, to those kind of countries, to Africa. And then you had the temperate stream of migration, so migration from Britain to the Americas, Britain to Australia. And so those kind of paths of migration never really broke down until after World War II. And this ties in to the victory of the Soviet Union, right? I mean, I respect the Soviet Union for two reasons. One, for class reasons, because, it's the world's first worker state. We all get that here. But on the other hand, the Soviet Union was an ally to national liberation struggles all over the world. So the problem we have with the theory of imperialism is that a lot of people who say, for example, Russia, China, Iran, all of these countries are imperialist, they do so simply because these countries are capitalist, or to the extent that they're capitalist. We can have the debate about China later if we want. And the problem here is that it completely ignores the geopolitical transformations that happened after World War I, because they're still stuck in that World War I mentality when the world is divided by a handful of empires and they're all fighting each other. Multiple capitalisms fighting each other with no room for national exploitation. What happened after World War II? All of the vast majority of Asia, Africa, that were previously under European colonial control, they got their independence. That was a huge relief. I mean, I'm so happy that I live in this timeline and not an alternate timeline if the Soviet Union were defeated in 1945. I mean, what would have happened? I mean, Germany would have had their slaves in the form of the Russians. They would have become the slaves of the German Empire, German Nazi Empire. The Italians would have taken North Africa, and the other old imperial powers like Britain and France would have had the rest of the planet. But instead, because the Soviet Union was willing to stand up not only for its own interests, but they were also fighting for the interests of the vast majority of the colonized, the vast majority of the population of the world who are colonized. And so after the Second World War, the world is different. You have camps. So, the Trotskyites, they often accuse us of campism. And my response is to say, and campism is correct. You have, one camp of the world's population that are the former empires, and they have an interest in maintaining the economic advantages that were won against their former colonies, including countries like India, right? Through systems of trade and things like that. So they demand that third world countries lift their trade barriers. And once they lift their trade barriers, the agrarian economy in the third world becomes exposed to the purchasing power of Western countries. Because Western countries, and this is a point that Utsa Patnaik, I mentioned Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik before, this is a point that she makes, which is that, they both make it, both the Patnaiks make it, which is that, the West needs the productivity, the agrarian productivity of the third world in order to fill its supermarket shelves. Like 70% of the items that you see at Coles or Woolworths, those are the two supermarkets here in Australia. They come from the tropics. I mean, maybe less so for Australia. It's probably not as high because we too are a large, resource-rich country, and we have plenty of our own agriculture. And then this ties directly into what you're seeing in India, because the Indian farmers, because the Modi government last year tried to introduce these new policies that would squeeze the Indian farmer further by getting rid of all the minimum support prices that farmers previously had, so that at the end of the harvest, they knew that they would be able to sell their produce to the government at a minimum support price. They wouldn't go under. Those minimum support prices are being eroded. I mean, over the past 15 years, there's been an agrarian crisis in India, in which hundreds of thousands of farmers have committed suicide. And so now they're trying to remove those support prices as well. And part of the reason is because, for the top 10% of India's population, they import all of these. They have this demand for all of these Western consumer goods and luxury items, right? Or what would be considered luxuries for the vast majority of the Indian population. Please tell me if I'm going over time. So the only way that they can pay for these, for these expensive items is by exporting something to the rest of the world to prevent India's balance of payments crisis from getting out of hand and to prevent India's rupee from depreciating. And so they look to the farmer, they squeeze the farmer. And so this is basically reintroducing those old colonial terms of trade that prevailed under the British Empire. So what I think is happening is the United States is using the comprador ruling classes of countries like India in order to support the value of the US dollar, because the US dollar is going into decline. So I think that's the kind of image of imperialism that I prefer, one that looks at the money form as the means by which US currency hegemony extracts value from the third world.
Yeah, very good, and thank you for that analysis. It's a very interesting one, and it's good to actually have another look at how we view imperialism, because even people have used the term divorce from what its actual meaning is. But the other time, there's the very dogmatic one, and it was one described. We've sort of locked up in that early 20th century word. Oh, that's imperialism, and that's also changed a lot over the course of the last 100 years as well. A very interesting point. And actually, we talked a lot about India there too. And obviously, just recently, it wasn't so long ago, we had the biggest strike in human history. I think well over 250 million. A lot of the parties, like the Communist Party India, Marxists, and many of the other communist parties there were right behind organising it. And the trade unions, I think it's the Centre of Indian Trade Unions, I'm led to believe, are highly involved in that. So it'd be good to hear from yourself, your views on that, and even update where that's at the moment.
Well, the farmers have been protesting against these laws. The minimum, the attempts by the government to remove whatever minimum protections they had. I mean, I think this has to be understood in the long trajectory of India's post-colonial history. So after 1947, India got its independence. And so from 1947 to 1991, India pursued what I would call dirigious planning. Sometimes it's referred to as socialist planning. And, this is under Nehru, the first prime minister, and then Indira Gandhi as well. And they did some good things. They nationalized the banks majority of the banks in 1969. But the thing is, up until 1991, at the very least, India wasn't growing anywhere near as fast as other countries. But at the very least, the net per capita food grain availability, that is, the average consumption of the Indian population, was increasing up until 1991. But then from 1991 onwards, that food grain absorption of the Indian population has actually been falling. And the reason it's been falling is because when India opens its markets to foreign purchasing power, the Indian producer starts to produce for that market. So where previously a farmer, let's say, would have produced just rice or just wheat, which is what the local population consumes, they would then switch their farm to producing cash crop, like rubber or vanilla or something like that, for which there's only a very small domestic market. The majority of the market is coming from the West because they've got the hegemonic currency. They've got the purchasing power, right? And what that does is it ends up driving up the price of food for the poorest people in India. So that's what's actually resulted since 1991 in the net per capita food grain availability of the Indian population falling or at least stagnating. And what's made it worse is that the Modi government seems to have been they fudged the figures. I mean, the fudging of the figures has happened before, So even under the Congress Party, which the before the BJP, for those who don't know, is like the Hindu Nationalist Party in India. Before that, you had the Indian Nationalist Congress Party, and they're more secular, and it's the party of Gandhi and Nehru, and they're not as antagonistic towards Muslims as the BJP, which is just outright hostile, because that's their way of dividing the Indian population against each other. But there's been a long history of just fudging the data, and now like recently I've noticed that they've gotten rid of those net per capita data points. So now we just know aggregate figures, but we don't know how the average Indian is eating anymore. Because there's this attempt to obscure the facts, on the ground, and unfortunately, this is a situation in which the Indian caste system plays a role, because a lot of the Indians that emigrate to the West, unfortunately, are upper caste, and they don't have a lot in common with the people at the very bottom who are struggling the most. And so that's why you get this phenomena of comprador Indians, going to the United States, getting into positions of power at the IMF, like, for example, Geeta Gopinath, from the IMF, Indian background. And she's praising all of these reforms by Modi, saying that it's going to, bring more labor market flexibility, which is just a euphemism for saying that they're going to squeeze the agrarian proletariat even more. So that's the situation, I think.
Right on. I think it's actually vitally too the significance of that strike. I think for anything, obviously the Western media, our media here in Australia, no doubt in the US as well, around the world, have tried to actually downplay this, or they've just touched on it, and not because correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to be proved wrong, but they actually do not want to actually see that. That's actually workers and the farmers. A massive strike. This is what you can do. Defiance of laws, of governments, and that. Now, I'd just like to relate it here originally when the head of the ACTU, he actually not talking about like bad laws should be broken. Just even though that was not as significant compared to what was happening in India, but actually obviously giving those workers in all the other respective countries the idea, well, if they can do it, why aren't we? Well, we can do it too. Would that be correct on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's also some important parallels, so not parallels, rather. I think there's ways in which Australia has the features of a post-colonial nation, and that's because Australia is a primary commodity exporter. I mean, if you take away the label Australia and just look at Australia as an economic entity, we look like a third world country, because what do we export? I mean, we export minerals, we export agricultural commodities, but geopolitically we side with the global north, with the United States and with Western Europe, because of that cultural connection. Australia began as an Anglo settler colony and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, I think that Australia has an interest in dirigist planning, in some degree of protectionism, so that we can get our industries back. But what we end up, so on the one hand, you're right. We don't talk about the labor struggles in other countries, because that might inspire workers to think about doing the same here. And on the other hand, we have Western exceptionalism, which says we're not like those other countries. We're so much better, and we're not despotic. So we have both of those kind of tendencies that kind of brainwashes, I think, a lot of Australians into thinking that we should be happy to put up with what we have here. And I think the same goes with China. There's, Australia, if you look at like Australia-China relations from the perspective of the working class, we would benefit from more protectionism with China, because if you have free trade with China, they're way more productive than we are, because of their own system. We would be outcompeted, and our industries would just suffer even more. So we need some degree of protectionism with China, but otherwise we want friendly relations with China. Right? I mean, they're not attacking us. We're the aggressors, unfortunately. I mean, we're the ones siding with the US attempts to contain the Chinese. But what the United States wants is the exact opposite. So they want Australia to have free trade with China, but also hostility with China, which leaves Australia vulnerable. Because if we don't have, domestic manufacturing in Australia, and we're going to become increasingly hostile to China, and on top of that, if our entire ruling class is Americanized, then what's going to happen is that the Americans are going to say to Australia, we need you to put these tariffs on the Chinese, or then the Chinese are going to respond with tariffs, and which they've already done, right? Yeah. And that's going to make the situation in Australia worse, So this is a situation where we have to break out of this programming as Australians, that we're just a part of the United States. No, I would say that Australia has a common interest with the rest of the tricontinent as a primary commodity exporter, to develop under protective tariffs instead of this free trade regime, which doesn't benefit us.
Well, it's actually an interesting point you put that, because well, it was only just a couple of weeks ago when I had to be in self-isolation. I got a phone call from a particular company. They make tin cans and that for powdered milk and baby formula, and their primary market was the Chinese market. And because of this FTA and trade war, redundancies, it wasn't a great way to start off the year. Being caught off guard, we had to be in self-isolate for 14 days. Plus, you get a call like that. But yeah, so I was not in a very good mood that day. When you hear about this thing, and especially too, it affects the community where this particular factory is. It's in a town called Kyabram, which is only just over an hour from Bendigo here. And for a town like that, that's devastating. And I could see it. And look, I do agree too. It's like I mentioned, this trade war is not going. The people are going to pay for it. Working families, whole working people in Australia. It's not going to be our US line rich people who it won't cost them anything. It won't cost them an arm and a leg. And the other thing as well, it's interesting to talk about trade protections, because obviously I'm a union background. Originally, I'm the union I'm involved in, talking about that, developing manufacturing, developing a strong manufacturing base, which actually be a backbone of a good, strong domestic economy. And yeah, it's that sentiment, and I think actually the big struggle I'm having is trying to get this anti-China sentiment out of the workplace that says no, China's not the problem. It's not they're not coming in here with stealing things. It's our own rules that are the problem. We need to actually get control here. Develop.
I mean, 83% of the mining profits in Australia go overseas, particularly to US shareholders.
Yep.
So can you imagine, what if these mines were nationalized and these resources stayed in Australia? And what if we had a nationalized banking system, which basically said, if you're going to invest in like a steel plant, like the Dutch produce more steel than Australia, even though we have all of this iron ore, And so I think the reason why a lot of Australian workers are anti-China is for reasons that make perfect sense. Like I said before that, I come from a middle class Indian Australian family, and so many of my father's friends, they came to Australia when we did have some industry. And they've been disillusioned by Australia because all those industries have gone, and many of them as well are blaming the Chinese, and they're saying the Chinese taking our jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And we have this mythology. It's because we have far superior living standards as workers. Our workers don't work as cheap as the Chinese. No, it's because the Chinese system of statecraft is far more advanced at disciplining their own capitalist class, and that's the lesson that we need to learn. They discipline their capitalists. If their capitalists get out of line, particularly in the banking sector, not only are they liable for long terms of imprisonment, but they might even be executed, right? And so these are the kind of things that we need to kind of communicate to the Australian working class, to say, look, our system is not superior. I mean, every society goes through these cycles of decadence, good times, they create weak people, and then weak people create bad times. This is like an old saying from Ibn Khaldun, who's an Arab historian. And so that's the kind of situation we have in Australia. We've had it good for a very long period of time, but we're on the cliff. We're on the precipice of things getting worse and worse, but in China, they're getting better and better. Why not look at the reasons why the Chinese have managed to industrialize and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and find solutions for how Australia can do the same?
Exactly, and it's interesting too. You point on about the mining industry here, because I organised in the Pilbara for 3 years, and it was right at the heartbeat of all that, with the iron ore side of it. And even too, they say, we pay a royalty to the Western Australian government, but that royalty is really low cost. It's actually cost what values comes out of the ground, not when it leaves port after being on the train, not when after say the likes of the big multinationals sell themselves on the world market and then sell themselves at a higher price. But in fact, we're basically giving all our natural resources next to nothing to them. And look, everything. It doesn't be the mining, it could be the oil and gas as well. And interesting on that, we don't refine our own oil and gas. we sell our oil and gas to the world market. We import our oil and gas and refine it. Well, what's the remnants of our refineries? Now we're dependent on refined fuel coming into into Australia, which is more of a concern because we're an island nation. We are dependent on shipping. Now, if something happens to our shipping lines, we've only got limited, I think, fuel supply for a few weeks. So you could just imagine the government will go and panic thing. We've got to prioritise military or God knows what else. But the general population like ourselves here, and everyone watching, we're going to suffer significantly. We're going to everything's come to a grinding halt. So it is certainly it should be something we're concerned here. Look, I understand the anger out there, and I think it's a challenge for all of us to try and help that anger towards our own rulers here. It's them that's been the problem, and we need to have a look at other models just to see how we can rebuild Australia into a new Australia.
Absolutely. And this is where I think revolutionary patriotism is the way to go. There's no point having a leftism that encourages self-hatred, because that's not appealing to anyone. There's plenty of examples from Australia's own history, like the Eureka Stockade Rebellion, that we can draw on. To have a nationalism that's capable of punching up, because right now we have a nationalism that's only capable of punching down. So it's always been the way. Like, it's been the way for the Australian ruling class to look at the majority white, former convict population and say, look, at least you're white, at least you're not like those other inferior races, and we're going to protect you from them by keeping Australia white. And so whenever immigrant communities came to Australia, they'd feel that racism, it's like, you don't belong here, you that kind of attitude. But what if Australian nationalism can be reconceptualized and remodeled in order to punch up? And I think the way to do it is by having a strong theory of imperialism that puts Australia at the center. Every country in the world with Marxists has to have a theory of imperialism that puts their country at the center, And I think the Americans do it because the Americans, are at the center of the Western world in many ways, and they speak the dominant world language. But here in Australia, my way of understanding the situation with Australia, the United States, and China is that the United States needs Australia to sell primary resources to China. And then because they do this, China is then willing to accept the US dollar, because the Chinese see Australia and the United States as basically one country. It's like, well, if the Australians sell us primary commodities, then we're willing to accept the US dollar. And so therefore, I think there's this desire on the part of the US ruling class to keep Australia as a farm and a quarry and nothing else. Because if we get our independence, if we become economically independent, that is, then it undermines that entire system. Because then it would mean that Australia and China could have, relations with each other that's independent of the United States. We wouldn't need the United States in this part of Asia.
That's right. Yeah, and it's an interesting point that too. About the independent dollar, because I know in some various left circles talking about our own independent step for how it would look like and how it would be structured, etc. Because for one thing, we would be having peaceful relations with our immediate neighbours around here instead of this trying to be on a war footing all the time and that. Because none of our immediate neighbours, but probably only Japan in World War II, but anyone else was not a threat to us. It really wasn't. But we've been involved in all these war ventures overseas, be it from Vietnam, Korea, Malaysia, and it certainly does not help us at all. Actually, the other thing you're talking about, events like Eureka and that, with the Goldfields Rebellion, because I did a little talk last year where it actually first started in Chewton, there just south of Goats near Castle, Maine. The first meeting of the first big, it was what they called the monster meeting. Tens of thousands of people were involved in that. Now, it wasn't armed conflict as such, but it was the start of a fight for, under the guise of no taxation without representation, similar to the American Revolutionary War of Independence. That took that cut because no one could run for even just things like Parliament. You had to be landed gentry, top brass military, or just extremely wealthy to be involved in any type of political apparatus whatsoever. So generally people like ourselves here weren't even allowed to vote. you know, and how they imposed the tax was pretty harsh. It was a harsh, brutal system back then. It wasn't paradise on earth, you know. It was harsh, brutal, and how they imposed it. And when I've actually heard some people talk about, oh, well, it's just about not paying tax, and trying to relate what happened with Western Australia 10 years ago about imposing a tax on mining. Well, no, that doesn't. It doesn't. It's not. You can't equivalent to that. Those are wealthy people, like such as Gina Reinhardt and all the rest of them, didn't want to pay any extra tax and are just extracting all the mineral wealth out of the ground to beef up their super profits. This was a different type of scenario altogether. It's not like people had an issue paying tax. It's just how it was all imposed, and so hence the term no taxation without representation. But we should actually garner that spirit, I think.
Absolutely,
I mean, you're right.
yeah.
We should garner it. I mean, after that, 2 years later, we had the Red Ribbon Rebellion here in Bendigo. It was the first time in a long time everyone wore red ribbons. It actually had a red flag. Some of the early red flags that I can cross, and it was actually the labour movement for the Central Victorian Gold Belt. So it had its birth in all of that. And I think that was something. It was actually the whole population was fully armed, but very well disciplined. It didn't lead to bloodshed. I don't know, but it was near to the point it did. It unfortunately a year later it did lead to bloodshed at Eureka, but it didn't stop there either. And there was a lot of struggles to be involved in, and we had a lot of improving. Yes, the trade union, enough organising workers, eventually it's semi-skilled, unskilled workers. The Wobblies played a huge role in the early part of the 20th century as well. There's these things are certain to pay to actually improve. And interesting, I'm going to do a little talk.
Australian nationalism should be, Australian revolutionary patriotism should be about punching up. And like the fact that here in this country, you can't, I think it's illegal now to fly Eureka flags on union sites. I think the ABCC just arbitrarily banned it. And so, I mean, maybe Dust James will be interested to know that the Eureka flag is probably the most Australian flag. I mean, among settler Australia, which includes me as well, that's probably the only kind of actual Australian flag, in the sense that it's a flag that emerged from within Australia's own history. It's not a Union Jack that was, that's the flag of a foreign country that we still have to this day on our Australian flag. But that flag, the Eureka flag, is not even allowed on work sites because of the arbitrary, tyranny of the ABCC.
Yeah, and just for the audience here, the ABCC means Australian Building and Construction Commission, which is basically it's an organisation made up of ex-federal police and other rural pro-employer bodies, and that is to what they call to enforce industrial law on site. It's actually there to actually inhibit unions' ability to organise workers, to improve health and safety, making sure that wages and conditions and agreements and that are abide to that. And what they try and do is, when they think you're in a breach of a certain industrial relation law, they'll put a subpoena into you. You're requested to go to a meeting with them, not voluntary. It's forced without any lawyer representation, and it's basically a Gestapo type of interrogation. And they can then try to look at putting up the criminal charges into a federal court. Nothing to do with industrial. It's certainly basically is a fascist. You could say it's a form of fascist type of organisation. I'm trying not to use that term lightly either, but very next to near it. So those of you who are overseas are wondering what that was, that's what we've got here. We
don't even have the right to strike in Australia.
No,
I think, look at that, right? I mean, all of the gains that are considered standard in maybe a country like France, you can go on strike whenever you want because they have more of a revolutionary history. We don't have that here in Australia. You have to get permission from, I think, is it Fair Work Australia, to take protected industrial action, and that's a huge weapon in the hands of the bosses, But beyond that, I do think it's important for trade unions to take on more kind of national demands that are at the level of statecraft. So the nationalization of the banks and the mines, I think, should be, at the top of the agenda. Because if you have those things, if you have a nationalized banking sector, then you can prevent money from leaving the country whenever the government does something that's unpopular for the ruling class. You can impose capital controls, and that's how Australia can actually reindustrialize.
Yeah. And it's a very good point, that, and I think that you're right, that needs to be back high on the agenda again. Well, I have not any further questions really relating to that, and look, I thank you for your views. I also opinions on both the Middle East and India there. It's been exceptionally great to have you on here and talking that way, and also about role in Australia as well, and also talking about a revolutionary way forward here too. And I think it's something worthwhile for all the audience, especially for everyone here in Australia, to take into consideration, because really how we're going about things at the moment, we're not getting anywhere. Waiting around for the government of the day to come along out of the sky to use these things, to do all this great stuff. It's not going to happen. We do have to get ourselves organised and prepared to fight for it. When we have got a rich history of fighting for things here in this country, and it should be emphasised even more. And just actually touching on that, you talk about nationalism and revolutionary patriotism. And I mean, we have once a year we have Anzac Day, which is in April. It's very dear to a lot of people, especially working class people out there. A lot of forebears fought in World War I, and my grandparents have fought in World War II. Now, fact is also too, but the whole distortion, there's been a big distortion about Anzac Day, deliberately done for these years, and turning a very nationalistic look, and that not realising, understanding that the first Anzac Day ever commenced was on the Western Front in the Somme, and it was actually a silent rebellion or a silent protest against imperialist war. I think people don't realise that. Yes, they did the ceremony of going down the sun, lest we forget. They remember their people, but it was actually a silent protest about for what they're doing, because Australian New Zealand troops were actually were regarded as second-class citizens and cannon fodder for British imperial interests. Even our nurses regarded as second-class citizens compared to the British system. So it was that type of it was a silent protest, because if you actually came out publicly to do it, it may not sound revolutionary, but you came out publicly and that you were actually pretty much arrested, court-martialed, then shot, which was a lot of people deserting in that time. And then from that, the idea was to put memorials in there, not just a memory about war, but it was actually there as a silent protest, and to the ruling classes, this is your fault. This is what you did. Just we won't ever let you forget about that. But unfortunately, for the last 100 years, well, especially I'll say since like 1980s, but especially the Howard era, when John Howard was Prime Minister, emphasised more into a nationalistic type thing, little digger Johnny in the trenches without.
Well, I mean, we were invading Iraq, I guess, so we needed some kind of war spirit to justify that. Yeah,
exactly. All right. Well, look, I don't have any further thoughts. Dust, did you want to ask any further questions as well, or anyone in the commentaries?
I'd like to look at the comments. Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's up to you. I mean, it's not my show.
We have one direct question that's a mild, looks like a funny kind of cultural question. It is from a Chicana comrade, Carla Hernandez. Is it true that the Australia has events, balls called BNS, Bachelor, and Spinster? Sorry, it's off topic. However, I have to know. Thanks.
Yes, we do. Carla, it's actually very busy in rural and regional communities. It's called the annual Bachelor and Spinster balls or things. It was actually quite a history of it for many years, where there was a lot more people living in regional Australia at the time. They come together as the community get together, especially young people, and they met their future partners and everything else. So obviously, it's more like a massive big party they have, and we've got this. But it's actually quite an interesting tradition about that. It was quite a what you could say. It's very local. Ingenious type creation. Yeah, it's a bit of a laugh about that, but in some aspects too, it brought people like big farming communities together at times once a year. But it's still a bit different. Unfortunately, it's just more to me. It looks more like an alcohol drinking session. Everyone just a big wild party, but yeah.
But I think it's also it's a necessary kind of part of rural life, because that's how people find their partners. Because if you live on a farm, like you're kind of isolated. There's just you and your family and a few neighbors. Like, how do you meet someone to start a family with? So you go to these events and BNS.
All right. I made a list of a few responses. I just want to say thank you for being on here. I don't think I've had such a such a good lecture since I gotten $1,000 of debt in college to hear such a thing. That was on par with a lot better than a lot of my professors, and that was amazing. And it was really inspiring, particularly the bit about the legacy of the Soviet Union. You mentioned how I really liked when you laid out that it basically prevented the British from being more imperialist towards India, and the Soviet Union being a power in the world helped in the anti-colonial struggle. In the United States, the victory of the Soviet Union against the Nazis and the strength of the Soviet Union had ripple effects, both for workers and the oppressed nations in the United States. Particularly the civil rights movement before the 1960s, back in the 40s and the 50s, it was the Communist Party. But specifically in the South, where I'm from, it was the Communist Party that organized the first interracial labor unions in the South. And it was the Soviet Union that publicized the pictures of Emmett Till, the man that was lynched, the African-American young man that was lynched in the South, that was published by the Soviet Union. And then it was the Soviet-led party inspired by the Third International that fought against Roosevelt and pushed Roosevelt to get what we have today: Social Security, 40-hour work week. All these things are directly tied to the victory of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party that was inspired by that, to fight and give us the little rights. They've been under attack ever since, specifically in the 1950s and the McCarthy era, where I've had, some of the older comrades tell me their parents were dragged out of their houses and tortured and told to give up names. And we've basically, there basically hasn't been a communist movement in the United States because of the McCarthy era. But the legacy of the Soviet Union has been amazing, and it has so many accomplishments and ripple effects, not only for the oppressed nations, African American community, but the working class in general.
Absolutely, and I think it's extremely important in Western countries that we reclaim the Soviet Union as something that was a progressive force in the world, and the reason is because if you speak to an ordinary guy on the street and you say, "Look, I'm a socialist. I think we should have socialism," I think one of their first responses would be to say, "Well, wasn't that a disaster in the Soviet Union? Look at what happened there. Millions of people died, China, etc." And then you've got two choices here, right? You can either say, yes, every single time that socialism has been tried, it's been an absolute failure and it's horrible. But then when you do that, you're not really instilling any faith in socialism, are you? Right? Like, why would anyone want to, if once you make that concession, why would anyone follow you? I mean, it's just extremely arrogant when I see, some of our Trotskyites here, proclaim that it's going to be great when they do it, So, okay, Lenin, Stalin, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, all of these people across the world who have actually managed to overthrow their governments and implement a new system, they're somehow, inferior to you as an organizer. Like, come on. Like, this is the kind of this is where Western exceptionalism, like I said before, leads us. This idea that, other countries are just inferior because of their own, whatever it is, they're just inferior to us, and we're the ones that have the answers. And this is something that you see like among the mainstream right and the mainstream left, unfortunately.
Yeah. And just touching on that, I mean, when I've come across people on the left, and just more so the Trotskyite tendencies here, when they're saying, "Oh, well, that wasn't real socialism," or they weren't true revolutionaries. I always have a little question. Sometimes I've actually had to ask in a little bit more hostile terms at times. It's, "Well, you ever led a revolution? Have you? Have you actually tried building something?"
Yeah.
Because and they obviously then they want to get into a wind-up or argument, but that's the question I put back to them. Well, then how would you know about it? And all right, go and prove it then, to see if your method's right. And they actually haven't produced anything at all. And the thing is, what they don't understand, that when socialism came into being, you had the Russian Revolution, Civil War, it was under attack since day one. All the time. And there was all moves to try and disrupt it, both internally and externally. I had this discussion with someone just lately, about what happened in the 1930s and the purges and stuff. Mistakes, mate, of course they were. But the thing is, it was under consistent attack, and at times, it's same within, going on in China and, and elsewhere around the world. And people even say Vietnam, well, when I like to turn around, well, Vietnam got on top of this COVID-19 in no time flat. I mean, they got a population of 94 million and they had 200 cases. It says
even if you look at the election of Donald Trump, right? I mean, I remember one of his quotes that just stuck with me. This is when Donald Trump was campaigning to be president. This is back in 2015. And, the media was attacking him, from the perspective of US imperialism and saying, well, why do you say good things about Bashar al-Assad and all that kind of stuff? And why do you praise Vladimir Putin? And his response was to say, what, do you think we're so innocent? And what I liked about that is because he was the first American presidential candidate who undermined the myth of Western exceptionalism. And I think this has just accelerated, especially with COVID, because the countries that have handled it the best have been socialist run, so even in India, which part of India has handled the COVID situation the best? It's been Kerala. I mean, I'm from Kerala. So I'm not saying that just as Kerala, but it's because Kerala has a communist party in charge, whereas the rest of India, it's Kerala has spent about as much per capita on its own population as the central government has on the entire Indian population. That gives you an idea of the difference. So Vietnam, China, they've done exceptionally well. I mean, they don't have lockdowns in China the way that we do in the West, because as soon as the virus hit, their immediate response was, okay, how do we contain it, tackle it, and control it? And the Chinese were able to say to their businesses, you are going to produce personal protective equipment now, right? And because in China, capital is at the mercy of the state, more so than in Western countries where the state is at the mercy of capital, they're able to do that because they discipline their capitalist class. Now, we should be citing these as examples to follow, rather than looking at these countries as these, tyrannical Eastern Oriental despotisms that are inferior to us in every way.
Yeah, and it's good actually you're pointing out this Western exceptionalism. And actually, for those who actually out there, especially on the left, are still going on about their few things, might be not supporting China, Russia, and all that. Also, too, the thing they're not realising what they're doing, they're playing into the hands of the extreme right. The extreme right, when they turn about the West is best, the Proud Boys, West is best, and all that. We're exactly taking on parallel lines with them as well. So it's always something to be careful of. And I actually quite take my hats off to all the socialist nations here that actually, and around the world, they actually got on top of it in no time and got on top of this COVID-19. Because I believe there was someone from the Netherlands, Lex Immers, how we handled it here in Australia. Well, the fact is, when it first arrived here, and I know I was from Victoria here, yes, it was, I don't think anyone had a clue really how we're going to go about, so they just looked at other models. Well, we'll try this. We did lock down for a period of time in autumn, but thing is, I think, we'll start lifting it up again, although there was murmurs in the background, don't just go instant lift up, because this can spread out again. And hence why, too, there wasn't proper quarantining systems put in place. And then came July, things started to get out of hand again, and that's when it exploded here in Victoria. And then we had to actually go for it. Then I took some serious measures of locking down, especially Melbourne and in regional Victoria to a lesser degree, to get on top of this again, because it was only out of hand, because we were seeing what was happening in the United States, in the UK, and the UK's, it's just, I know also, I do feel for everyone in those two countries, respectively. And obviously our state government here was under attack. Murdoch, talk about Murdoch again, is on the thing as well. But the thing is, majority of the population supported the state government in the sense of getting this back down, because we didn't want to get this out of control. It caused a lot of disruptions in business and everything else. Yes, it did. We won't make an example of that, but we had to do it because they had to think about the health of the situation. Look what just recently happened in New South Wales. They were pretty laissez. The government up there was pretty laissez about it, and even I got caught off guard when I was down the New South Wales side of the border, and we had to get back at a particular time. But unfortunately, I didn't get back in time. I had to go isolate for 14 days, although it didn't go for that long, thank God. But it was so. We can see it happening, and obviously things they need to get things on fast, because I think it's always saying, people say, oh, well, we're pretty lucky here in Australia. It wasn't bad compared to what it was. Well, there might be a sentiment of truth in that, but it wasn't that case at all. So I think it's just the wrong class. I think we got to get things happening here because they're concerned about the economy shutting down. And I noticed that, just going back to what I was saying with the attacks on the Andrews government, but no, hardly any attack on the New South Wales government, because even the Premier of New South Wales let it slip that they need to keep businesses going. She was more concerned about keeping businesses going and business going than about actually the population's health, where they didn't say it here in Victoria, let alone Western Australia and Queensland, but there was a sense, well, worry, but the health of the population comes first. But it just shows you here the business attitudes to the general population says, no, business is priority, your health comes second place.
And I think there is something particularly cruel about societies around the world that impose lockdowns, but they have no welfare system to compensate the working class for those lockdowns. And so the workers are like locked down and they're starving, So this is the case in India. This is the case in Brazil. This is the case in the United States. I know they're waiting for their stimulus checks over there, right? But it's nothing compared to the kind of state spending that we've had here in Australia. So yeah, that's, I think, the major kind of contradiction with the COVID thing. That's why a lot of people come out saying it's not real, and you've got COVID deniers. I think part of that is actually coming from the right place, because they see all the displacement and they see that the workers are being made to pay the costs, and in that situation we have to say no. This is a genuine public health emergency, and it's the capitalist class that has to pay for it.
And you sure you ain't been watching my show, man?
You've been saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Dust James has been saying this to the American people.
Yes,
so I should.
So we'll just make it official.
That's great, though. Not as articulate as you have, then, man. Man, that was great. Maybe I have a few more questions. I really liked how you mentioned the Indian Marxist addition to the idea of imperialism. My idea of imperialism is almost directly from Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, but also Stalin's advancement in Leninism, Foundations of Leninism, where he talks about the three main contradictions that amongst the imperialists, that of the work, he calls it the main one, which is the workers and the capitalists, and then the oppressor nations and the oppressed nations. And then my theory currently is that imperialism, or the monopolization of capital, has gone to the point that even Lenin didn't predict. Lenin predicted world revolution before the point that capital is so concentrated, and the exploitation of the third world nations is such an extent, and they have built this elaborate amounts of political systems, economic systems to maintain the exploitation of the third world, and which is in correlation with the exploitation here. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about your understanding of imperialism and how the Indian Marxists have added to that understanding.
Sure. Well, the point that I make in my thesis is that Lenin politically understood national exploitation, but national exploitation did not feature in his theory of imperialism. So what do I mean by that? If you read his 1916 text, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he makes the export of capital the primary economic function by which nations exploit other nations. But there's a major problem with this. So Lenin said, the export of capital influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported. And that it may, to a certain extent, arrest the development in the capital exporting countries. But if this is the economic mechanism underpinning imperialism, then it rules out even the possibility of national exploitation. And that's because these backward countries are being spurred into development by externally originating capital, that too at the economic expense of the imperial power. And I think part of the reason why Lenin made the export of capital a central part of his thesis, and I'll explain why I think like Lenin was fundamentally correct later on. But the reason why I think he made this a part of his thesis is because he was appealing to the workers of the imperial nations. So he was appealing to the workers of Britain, of France, of Germany, and he was saying, look, the capitalists are exporting capital overseas rather than investing in your own country, because they want higher profits by investing overseas. That's why they do so. They don't want to put up with lower profits by investing in your country. Right. And so Lenin had an interest. This is 1916. It's in the middle of World War I. He had an interest in saying to the working class of all of these rival empires that are fighting each other, of saying, look, your working class does not benefit from imperialism. Only the financial capitalist class benefits from it. But then if you look at what Lenin wrote in 1920. So this is after the war. The revolution is secure. The Bolsheviks have won. Lenin addresses the Comintern, and he says he basically says imperialism is national exploitation. In fact, I have it right here because I was looking at it. This is from the CPA, because the Soviet Union used to send over like large amounts of books to the Communist Party, and so I bought this once, and it's actually quite revealing what Lenin says. Just one quote where he said, I hope I can find it. Oh wow, thought I had it. I had it saved. That's right. Okay. So he says, the characteristic feature of imperialism consists in the whole world, as we now see, being divided into a large number of oppressed nations and an insignificant number of oppressor nations. So he was actually, by 1920, he was starting to see imperialism more in terms of oppressed nations versus oppressor nations, rather than the previous 1916 model of imperialism, which was based simply around multiple capitalisms, each internally divided by classes, and class exploitation being the mechanism. And so I think this is where Indian political economy helps, by saying, the problem is that the model of imperialism that we get from Lenin in 1916 features only it only conceptualizes money as a single universal commodity. But in the real world, we have multiple currencies. So you have the US dollar, and then you have all of these currencies of the third world. And since 1971, all of these third world currencies have been depreciating against the US dollar, which means that third world countries have to churn out more and more by way of exports in order to prevent their currency from collapsing. And so these are the mechanisms by which the United States is able to maintain the economic advantages that were won by its predecessors. Because after World War II, the United States took on this new responsibility. They said, look, we are now going to unite all of the former empires under our control, and we will collectively subjugate the rest of the planet. Now, this ideology is actually very similar to Nazi Germany, because what the geopolitical logic of white supremacy for someone like Adolf Hitler was to say, we, the white race, should collectively subjugate the non-white world and exploit them. And on the backs of their labor, we'll be able to compensate our own working class. So it's basically saying to your own working class, look, we're not willing to, like the capitalist ruling class, we're not willing to share with you the proceeds of industry and everything like that, but instead, we'll invade and conquer these other people, and by squeezing them, we'll be able to compensate you sometime in the future. So that's I think the fundamental argument that they're putting forward, and actually that's actually something that runs something that's actually continuous with the United States, because the United States inherits that interest in maintaining this control. That being said, there's a lot of people who criticize that by saying, you're making it seem like the workers of imperialist countries benefit from imperialism. And I have a response to that as well, which is to say yes and no. On the one hand, so for example, the United States, right? On the one hand, you have this currency that does not really experience inflation the way that currencies in other countries do, which is why the United States is able to run up these massive trade deficits. No other country in the world is able to run the trade deficits that the United States has. So on the one hand, you can get all of these commodities from other parts of the world, but on the other hand, you lose all of your industries, right? So in this situation, I think the American working class would benefit from ending US currency hegemony. And the only way you can do that is by going to the Chinese, the Germans, the Russians, and saying, look, we will, what are you, if you destroy a large amount of your US dollars, what do you want us to do? You know? And if that were to happen, if the United States were to regain its, like, we're no longer the hegemonic currency, then it would no longer have to pursue these free trade policies, because the reason why the US pursues free trade is because it wants to, the US as the leader of this imperial system has to accommodate all of its rivals like Germany and China, because these countries, these rivals, they see the United States as a market, you know, a market for their goods that they can export their goods to. So I'm saying that, like, yeah, on the one hand, the United States benefits because they have this imperial currency, but on the other hand, they don't, because they don't have any industry. So I think the Americans, like, in the short term, if this were to happen, like the US were to get rid of its currency hegemony, I think in the short term, there would be a price that you'd pay in terms of higher levels of inflation and things like that. But in the long term, you would rebuild your industry. And I think the people who understood this, especially in, like, the Rust Belts of the United States, where the deindustrialization has happened the worst, those are the kind of people who said, you know what, I'm going to vote for Trump. And so the people, even though I don't sympathize with Trump at all, I think he's a war criminal, the people who actually voted for him, I think, are the people that socialists should win over.
Wow.
Exactly.
Right. Great points, man. And
Yeah.
I was actually, I was watching a program who was talking about how the reason why they're able to maintain the currency hegemony is because when other countries when the global market starts to crash, usually in the US, like 2008, and now with the COVID, then those third world countries, their countries have inflation first. And what they do is they invest in the US dollar immediately, and that raises so the US can basically create all the money it wants, getting as much debt as it wants to, and it's the third world countries that are forced to invest in it and take in the consequences.
Yeah.
And it's a Ponzi scheme. It doesn't. I mean, we can buy stuff from China, and we can buy this or that, but I mean, if we don't have any cash coming in, and it doesn't help much.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why you have, like, this desire for a kind of universal basic income, you know, because it's a way of kind of maintaining the levels of demand. So if you imagine that a large percentage of the American working class becomes superfluous because of deindustrialization, like, you know, Joan Robinson, famous economist, she said that there's only one thing worse than being exploited, and that's not being exploited, because then you don't have any money, you don't have any wages. And so the universal basic income is a way of saying, look, we have the currency hegemony. All we need to do is, like, give money to people. But then, you know, that there's problems, you know, when it comes to imperialism, because that just kind of reproduces the cycle of relying on the rest of the world to do all the producing, and the United States just remains a consumer nation. I think every country should develop evenly, you know. So I look forward to a future where, you know, Africa, India, the United States, Australia, we all have somewhat equal living standards. We all have our own industry. We're not totally dependent on one country for its industry and another country for its financial system. And I think that kind of an existence would be far more rewarding for the American people as well.
Yep. Very good.
Right on. I had a question about some of the income disparities between the larger landowning class of farmers in India versus the proletarian workers and some of the smaller farms. From my understanding, the law that they got rid of part of what the farmers were fighting was a law where the farmers would sell their goods to the state, and then the state would sell to the corporations. And from my understanding, there was inequalities within that law. That law overall helped the rural area in general and the farming class in general, but it more helped the larger land-owning class and the larger farmers than the proletarian farmers.
Sort of. I mean, like there are wealthy farmers that are protesting this. That's certainly true, because it's a minimum support price that they get rid of. I mean, when you have a minimum support price, then what it means is that if somebody wants to buy your grain at a higher price, and that's fine, they can do so. But you at least have that basic level of protection. And so, but the problem is that when you get rid of like a support price like that, the squeeze just gets pushed down the hierarchy, because India is a very hierarchical structure because of the caste system. So you might have landowning castes, that are protesting these policies, but if these if the minimum support prices were to go, then they're just going to pass on the costs. They're going to say to the agrarian proletariat. So if you have, for example, a landowner in India, they own a large plot of land and they hire like landless laborers. If the prices get lower and lower, what's going to happen to those landless laborers? They're going to get even lower prices. So this is like undermining like wealthy, mid-tier farmers, but they're just going to pass on those costs to those below them anyway. So that's just going to make the problem worse. The real problem in India is that India never had the kind of land reforms that China did. China had extensive land reforms, and that's the thing. When you have a socialist revolution, you can do that. India never had like a massive proletarian uprising that totally changed everything and flipped the entire society upside down. I mean, in the case of China, they had a lot of chaos and the Cultural Revolution, all kinds of bad stuff happened. But the fundamental class character of the Chinese state was transformed by what happened in 1949 with Mao's revolution. Something similar did not happen in India. And so that's why, that's why the agrarian relations were never really settled the way that they could have been. And so, like in India, yeah, you have so it gives you an idea of how bad things are in India if even the middle farmers and the bigger landlords are protesting against the government's policies.
Very good. Very good. Actually, just a question like that too, just because what the recent events in India, I was just actually having a little bit of a think about that. Yeah, I was discussing this the other day with someone. Do you think this is actually a quantitative change that will eventually lead to a qualitative one, to a revolutionary situation? Possibly? Possibly.
I think part of the reason for that is because the Congress party in India has been thoroughly discredited. Right. Yeah. And that's because they presided over neoliberalism, like from 1991 onwards. And there was a period, I think, up until 2008, 2009, when India sort of benefited from neoliberalism, but that's because the United States was exporting capital. So the United States is a big part of this picture, because it's important to have this global picture when we're talking about imperialism. In the early 1980s, the United States was the biggest capital exporter in the world. After the global financial crisis, after 1991, around then, the United States became a net capital importer. And after the global financial crisis, the United States became the biggest capital importer in the world, right? And so that meant that, before 2008, India was getting some investment from the United States, which was helping India to develop its IT sector, which is good in a sense, because India develops a more diversified economy. So those things were going well. But then after 2008, when the United States could no longer perform the role of exporting capital to the third world, to developing economies, what happened is that the United States started sucking money out of the third world. So they'd look towards the elites in the third world and they'd say, look, why don't you bring your money into the United States, invest in our economy, And that's why, that's what led to the housing bubble in the United States in 2008 to begin with. All this money coming in, all of the US industry is gone. So they pump up the housing market, and then that collapses in 2008. And so you have this problem in India where, food price inflation or what happens is that, as more of India's food gets bought up by multinationals and they start exporting it to the rest of the world, this puts pressure on food prices to go up, and this causes inflation in the Indian rupee. And then the Indian elites, in order to escape the inflation of the Indian rupee, they take all of their money overseas to the safe haven of the US banking system or the UK banking system. And that just makes the problem in India worse, because it causes imports to become more expensive. Oil becomes more expensive. The Indian rupee devalues. And this is a problem across the board in the third world.
Very good. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, to answer your question, because you were saying quantitative change, quantitative to
Yeah.
qualitative. So this is the qualitative change. The United States is no longer able to perform that role that they were able to perform of exporting capital.
Yeah.
The Congress Party has been completely discredited because they have poor leadership. And in this context, I think what a lot of Indians are seeing is that the country, the state in India that is the best governed is governed by a communist party. And so the
Yep.
Communist Party of India, Marxist, I think has immense potential to join forces with other popular proletarian political parties and Dalit, because Dalits are the untouchables in India, to join forces with their organizations to put forward a new coalition that's capable of governing India in the interests of the vast majority.
And certainly be very exciting if things advance sort in that direction. I mean, especially for India, and obviously it will cause the imperialists, the world banks, and the international banks, financiers, and that a lot of they'll be heading in further into crisis. But I think it will be a huge shot in the arm for the world revolutionary movement as well. I think it certainly needs, especially for such a population scale, large, the second most populous country on the earth. Just I think you're just behind China. That will certainly be a big shot in the arm for the revolutionary movement from all over the world.
We've been going on for quite a while. I think we're getting close to 2 hours. Maybe we can go ahead and we still have a whole nother section to do. Maybe we can go ahead and move on to our talking to workers workshop.
Sure, I'm happy to keep going.
All right,
it's up to you,
David.
yeah.
So, if from my understanding, it's David's turn to grill me. David's going to come up. He's going to do an acting scene. He's going to either be a reactionary worker or a liberal worker, and he's going to come up with an unprincipled statement, and then I'm going to counter that, and then we can have a discussion about it.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So, the first question I'll have here. We talked about this before. Instead of being anti-imperialist, why not just support Bernie Sanders, especially when he's advocating for free health, etc.?
That's a fair argument. I think it's inspiring that people are understanding that these Hillary Clinton types, Biden types, even Kamala Harris with her background, it's good they're looking into that. They're good they're looking for alternatives. But if you look at what Bernie Sanders has done, he says he wants to get us health care, minimum wage, and he says he's been pushing for that. But all he seems to be doing, he dropped out of it. He dropped out of the race like twice, and he ended up backing the person who said they were going to veto health care. He said he was going to veto healthcare. And then he goes on and he calls people like Maduro. He calls him a dictator. He calls him a tyrant. He ends up going along with these imperialist policies. And in the United States, which is one of the providers of the imperialist systems, the global imperialist systems military, it's healthcare that pushes us to join the military. They can't have these wars have us readily be able to join without holding healthcare over our head. We need to be anti-imperialist. We need to stand in solidarity with the third world. When they attack one country, they attack us. International solidarity. And it's not just some kind of theme. It has physical consequences. When they attack a country or they destroy Mexico's economy, and we have a flood of immigrants from Central America, and we have a flood of immigrants from Mexico in the 90s. I mean, this does lower wages, and it lower wages because they destroyed those countries in the first place. And instead of pushing harsher treatment towards immigrants, and treating the immigrants worse, we should unite and fight with the immigrants against the capitalists. And that's what it is on an international basis. And I think these policies of the Social Democrats in Europe, they are funded by the imperialist system. Europe's wealth is because of the exploitation of the third world. They have a bigger socialist movement to push for those things. But it's interesting. It seems like being at the core of the imperialist bloc that we should have it better, but it's actually had the opposite effect. Because they're a little bit further from the imperialist bloc and their bourgeoisie in Europe is weaker, their socialist parties and organizations haven't been as repressed as we are in the United States. They are able to have universal health care and other stuff. But we're denied it. And it's because we're being pushed into a police state, military state, no benefits, and that's globalization. That's what's happening. I know that was a little bit long-winded, but Jay, do you have any response to that?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well.
Very well. Well, as this discussion moving forward, I thought this is an interesting one, and I've been in discussions about now. We talk about being anti-imperialist, then why do we turn around and support China and Russia? Because aren't they imperialist?
Yeah, oh, is this for Dust? Sorry, I should leave this with you.
No. Go ahead.
No.
Only because I've been researching this a fair bit. I think part of the reason why a lot of people think that Russia and China are imperialist is because China is the world's largest exporter of capital. So if you go by Lenin's original understanding of imperialism in 1916, export of capital is a hallmark of imperialism. Therefore, China must be imperialist. And the reason I think they consider Russia to be imperialist is because, well, in World War I, Russia was considered imperialist. But why? Why was it considered imperialist? And that's because prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Empire ruled over all of these non-Russian nations. They ruled over Caucasia. They ruled over Central Asia, all of these Turkic Islamic peoples. And so for that reason, there was a kind of national exploitation that happened, so it was Moscow and the European, the Slavic parts of Russia that developed, and the Asiatic hinterland was underdeveloped and backward. And it's in that context that Russia was considered imperialist in the World War I context. But then the Soviet Union happened. And what happened with the Soviet Union is that they gave all of these nations that had previously been conquered by the Russian Empire their own borders within the Soviet Union. And what's telling is that in 1991, when the Soviet Union was on the verge of breaking up, when they gave a vote to all of these republics, I mean, the ones that took part, the highest votes for staying in the Soviet Union were from Islamic, Turkic, Central Asia. So this is not something you'd expect. Like, you would not, if the British gave a vote to the Indians in 1945 and said, do you want to stay within Britain? I think the vast majority, 95%, would say no. But this is a situation in which 95% of the Central Asian population of Russia are saying, yes, we want to keep the Soviet Union. And so pro-Soviet nostalgia is very strong in these Central Asian countries. As for China, it is the biggest exporter of capital in the world. But then, the export of capital, if you look at it historically, when Britain was the largest exporter of capital in the world, yes, it was imperialist, but, the reason why Britain was able to export that capital is because they were ripping off India. They were extracting surpluses from India, which they then used to, see this question by Helen, right? She says, isn't export of capital only one aspect of what constitutes imperialism? True, it's only one, but it's held up as like the major economic mechanism. I can't think of any other economic mechanisms. I mean, there is monopoly, but that explains that's a state of being. That's not really a mechanism of movement of how money flows and exploits and does all of that. So China is the world's largest exporter of capital. But when Britain was the largest exporter of capital, this was primarily a privileged economic relationship. So Britain would export capital to those places in the world that had exported its own population. So David, you are a beneficiary of the British export of capital. right? Because your ancestors came to Australia alongside a lot of British capital to help Britain, to help Australia as a settler state get started and set up. But what was the basis of the British export of capital? It was the fact that they had 1/6 of the world's population, or 1/5 if you include what's modern day Pakistan and Bangladesh. That is, they had India, 70% of the British Empire, being simply looted and plundered. And this is what allowed Britain to export capital. Now, what allows China to export capital? It's simply the fact that they rely on the exploitation of their own working class. They're not engaging in national exploitation. Now, you can say, well, within China, you've got the Uyghurs and you've got Tibet. You have these nations that are oppressed by the Chinese government. And you might be able to make an argument through the national question that that's happening, right? Because, there's Han chauvinism and all of that. But on a purely economic level, there's even development throughout China. Okay, in the sense that if you look at the per capita incomes of large Han Chinese parts of rural China, they're pretty much exactly the same as Tibet. They're exactly the same as Xinjiang. So there's no economic exploitation by like Han China against like non-Han China. So yeah, China's exporting capital, but they're doing so off the backs of their own productivity. They haven't enslaved 1/6 of the world's population, which is what Britain did in order to help them export capital to countries like Australia.
Yeah. Wow, that was a great explanation. I guess I'll just break it down to some more basic way of talking about it. And that is exactly it. I mean, we're scientific socialists, and imperialism is characterized by economic exploitation. And to think and to say that what China is doing to Africa is the same as what the United States is doing to Latin America and the rest of the third world is absolutely insane.
Yeah. Actually, just on that point, what China is doing in Africa is very similar to what Britain did in Australia. Because Britain exported capital to Australia, and the end result is that Australia ended up as a country with even economic development with Britain, similar living standards, that kind of thing. Better living standards because we have cheaper meat here, so I think that's really important. Whereas similarly with China and Africa, what they're doing is they are building capitalism in Africa. That's true. Right. But, capitalism and imperialism are two very different things. Capitalism is a system of class exploitation. Imperialism is a system of national exploitation. It's possible for China to spread capitalism in Africa without being imperialist, for the same reason that it's possible for Britain to spread capitalism in Australia without having to make the argument that Britain is somehow exploiting settler Australia, when it's quite obvious that settler Australia developed on an even basis, ultimately, with their counterparts in Britain.
Right on. All you got to do is compare, look at the IMF and look at the austerity boards. When the IMF loans money to places and they don't pay it back, then they basically take that country's government over and then say you're not allowed to have healthcare, not allowed to nationalize industry, and they put neoliberal regimes and outright exploitation. These are the mechanisms of super exploitation. That is the basis of imperialism. And I would argue, based on Lenin's definition of imperialism, Russia is not imperialist. China is not imperialist. They are not super exploiting the countries they are coming into contact with. I think on the opposite hand, they're building up these countries. China says win-win trade. It truly is win-win trade. They're lifting millions of people in their own countries out of poverty, and they're lifting people in Africa out of poverty through beneficial trade. I think that's a world model that everyone needs to look at. And when workers come to power in the United States, before we completely transition into higher stages of socialism, I think that is exactly what needs to be done. That is the basis for socialism, is developing the productive forces.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's what you said, that the Chinese, Yanis Varoufakis, he was with the Syriza government in Greece. Now, whatever the criticisms are of them, if there's KKE comrades listening, Yanis Varoufakis said something very interesting about China. He said, because he got a question from someone in the audience who said, I'm worried about China exploiting Africa, and he said, China is nothing like the United States. They're far more humanistic. And he gave an example of Greece. He said, when I went to the Chinese and I said, look, you're not paying our workers properly, all of this other stuff, and he basically negotiated with the Chinese and said, give us a better deal. The Chinese agreed. And he said, can you imagine if that was a Western European firm or a German firm or something like that? They'd probably say no. But there is a danger. I mean, there is a danger of Chinese capitalists, for example, bribing African politicians, or politicians in any other country. And so it is incumbent upon the countries that receive Chinese investment that they're getting the best deal possible for their people. And that's something that these countries can only do themselves.
Yeah.
Exactly. Western Trotskyites and people on the left calling China imperialist. It's insane because it's so hypocritical that they'll support politicians like Bernie Sanders and people like this while acting like that is just as bad. And I like what you said about it's only for those sovereign countries to fight for their people. The U.S. imperialist government has never acted on behalf of other countries and other interests.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Well, look, I'll apply on the last question. Because actually, we're talking about China. I was going to ask something completely different, but all right. Look, you're saying we're a bit behind. We support China from an imperialist point of view. But what about their role in Tibet, crushing the Tibetans, and also their treatment of the Uyghurs?
Well, I mean, did you want to go, Dust, or do you have something to say?
I just have a short thing. I think there was this meme going around on Facebook where it showed like people who recognize, they call it Uyghur genocide, people who recognize Uyghur genocide. And the countries were the US, Australia, and Europe. And the people that were supporting China were all these African countries and a lot of third world countries. So that doesn't make any sense. Just like you said with the Soviet Union, like why were all these Muslim countries supporting to keep the Soviet Union together? Why is it only wealthy countries are recognizing this supposed thing of genocide, and there is no mass migration to other places? Like it's the only genocide in human history doesn't have mass migration and exodus. Like I don't know exactly. Go ahead.
I know friends who are very sympathetic, who are Chinese, sympathetic to the Communist Party. They're Australian Chinese, and they have a background, like their families are like multi-generations of Communist Party members. And they say to me, look, that they themselves don't like the way the Chinese are treating the Uyghurs, but I think the point to be kind of stressed here is that, okay, on the one hand, what the Chinese are doing, with all these internment camps, it's certainly not liberal. I mean, from what I understand, they are rounding up people on suspicion, putting them in camps, and trying to de-radicalize them. But there's no killing going on, right? They're putting them in camps because they suspect that they've been radicalized. And the reason they have these suspicions are for good reasons. And this is what the Western media keeps missing. Over the past 10 years, something like 10 to perhaps 20,000, that's the upper limit, 10 to 20,000 Uyghurs from China have traveled to countries like Libya, Syria, Iraq, to fight as mercenaries for Turkish foreign policy. Okay, because this is something that's happened throughout history, by the way. I mean, this is something that Indians, Pakistanis, Iranians, Greeks, they all understand, which is that there is a long history of Central Asia exporting mercenaries, and this is basically continued. Like you look at the history of India. There's a long history of Central Asians invading India, settling, and like the Mughal Empire, for example. Right now, I'm not denigrating India's pre-colonial dynasties, because they came to India, they settled, they became indigenized over time. But the point is that there's a long history of Central Asia exporting mercenaries. And we see the continuation of that. We saw the continuation of that over the past 10 years. So, for example, there's a lot of the people who support the YPG in Syria who have issues with the way China's treating the Uyghurs are being slightly hypocritical here, because a lot of those Uyghur mercenaries in Syria were fighting against the YPG. So it's like when they're fighting against the YPG, they're Turkish-backed oppressors, but when they're fighting against the Chinese government, they're an oppressed nation. Like, you can't have it both ways. Unfortunately, 10 to 20, a population of 11 million, that's how many Uyghurs there are. A population of 11 million Uyghurs exported 10 to 20,000 mercenaries. That's a huge number. The entire Indian subcontinent, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, has a population of about 400 million Muslims. And the number of mercenaries that South Asia has exported to these battlefields in the Arab world have been probably under 1,000. Especially to join the ranks of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. So yes, to summarize, on the one hand, what China is doing is extremely illiberal, but it's extremely hypocritical for the West to take issue with this. We should take issue with the fact that Western governments, including Turkey, which is a part of NATO, have been arming and funding proxy terrorist groups to overthrow the Syrian government, to overthrow the Iraqi government. They've deployed them to Yemen as well. They used them to overthrow Gaddafi. This is our responsibility. Like, if we did not support all of these like mercenary wars, then the Chinese would not be resorting to these fundamentally illiberal policies, which I fully recognize. As for Tibet, I mean, you only have to read that piece by Michael Parenti, Friendly Feudalism, and he talks about how before the revolution in 1949, I mean, Tibet was a slave state. People would have their limbs amputated if they didn't produce enough produce for the feudal lord to expropriate. I mean, it was a horrible system. That's what the Chinese Revolution ended, with the support of Tibetan communists. So that the role of Tibetan communists is completely missing, and the voices of Tibetan reactionaries living in India, unfortunately, are magnified, and that's something that we need to question.
We're coming to the close of the show. We don't get a lot of direct questions. I'll just wanted to answer this one direct question. If capitalism lifts people out of poverty, how can you convince people of socialism? And I would counter that with it is a planned economy that China is lifting people out of poverty with. It isn't the neoliberal capitalism of the West. Now, whether you consider that socialism or not is another thing, but it's a completely different economic system. And it's why it's an advancement from neoliberal imperialism, what the Chinese have developed. They actually take into consideration the working class. A good example of that would be there is a huge divide between the rural and urban divide, which I talk about in the United States extensively. And there was a large urban development, and therefore more resources in urban life. And the Chinese government, because the government is in control, and not the profit system and not the profit motive, they can take money back and invest in the countryside. And now the government has decided to raise rural workers out of poverty. And they've also been able to stop COVID. And I would say I would consider it socialist. Some people would not, but on a material basis, the economic system in China is a more advanced and system and a system closer to socialism.
Yep.
I think part of the problem with these questions is that it assumes that capitalism is a person. It personifies capitalism, as if I can call up the CEO of capitalism and say, "Hey, thanks for lifting millions of people out of poverty, mate." But capitalism did. If you when people say that capitalism lifted people out of technology. What they're saying is that the property relations of capitalism, that is having a right to private property, it created the incentives for certain industrious individuals in the past to put money down on fixed capital investments, which then produced factories and all of that kind of stuff, and so there's this myth of capitalism that it's because of voluntary, mutual, non-violent, beneficial exchange. That's all what capitalism is. But then that, of course, ignores the ugly side of capitalism, which is that Britain, the first capitalist country, relied on stealing from 70% of the population of its empire in order to raise up the living standards of the 20% who lived in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States.
And just to add on that too, I mean, the fact is things weren't just given to us on a silver tray.
Had to be worked for.
You look at the conditions of what working class people in both Britain, Australia, and everywhere else from where we are now. I mean, that was hard fought for too. That was some bitter disputes, and that's actually part of our revolutionary spirit. I mean, besides 8-hour day, enjoying a weekend, having decent annual leave, some of the basic things we take for granted now wasn't just because, okay, you can have all this now, because we've done that to that ex-nation or that colony. It didn't happen that way either. So there was also a bit of fight, because even the workers here, we still had to actually fight to just even gain a few crumbs. So yeah, there's always the things taken into account. So for those of us who live in it's interesting. We're a first world nation, but we're part of the global south here, along with New Zealand. But those in the West and everything else, Canada, US, Europe, UK, all those things they do enjoy. Yes, on the imperialist plunder, but also at the same time, the working class of those countries at its peak were well organised, and they fought for a lot of those conditions that they did enjoy. So I think that's a very big lesson to learn. We have to actually fight for something. We've got to be organised and there to fight and have a strategy around it.
And I agree totally with what Dust said before, about the largest lifting of poverty, over the past 100 years has been China. Like, China's lifted, I think 100% of the poverty reduction. Like, if you take China out of the picture over the past, I think it's since World War II. If you take China out of the picture, then poverty has actually increased. If you include China in the picture, then 100% of the poverty reduction has actually come from China. And so, then you have to look at the relations between capitalists and workers in a country like China. And I would say that what differentiates China from the West is that in China, capital exists at the mercy of the state, whereas in the West, the state exists at the mercy of capital.
Oop, you froze up there. You might be back on.
We'll come back.
I'll just send him a message. He's just froze up.
Froze up.
He's back.
He's back here.
Yeah.
All right, that was that. Anything more to add, Jay?
No, I'm done.
That's been good. It's been a great session today.
Oh, it's been great. Wow. Free-flowing conversation.
Just on something rather amusing, how we said, Britain exporting a lot of people here to this country and that as well. I mean, look, the ancestors that did come from there, obviously, and that one was actually one of John Pomeroy, who was actually an English chartist coming out on the Isabella. And that's it was quite interesting. We've also got a very rich history of revolutionaries coming in from Europe and UK, and French Canadians at one stage came in. Sent here, and Irish rebels as well. But I just want to say export Britain. I just want to say, hello, Governor, how you keeping?
A lot more to talk about.
Oh, it certainly is.
All right, we're coming to the end. We're coming to the close of 2 hours. That I don't think we've gotten in depth on stuff like that in a while. That was pretty good. And all this stuff that David's been talking about for a long time, you just put it's crystal clear now. Like about Australia. I get it now. Any last words before we do our final chant from either of y'all?
Well, just on for next week, we have Helen Woolley, who's been making comments as well. So I'll send it a link too. So we've got Helen Woolley for next week. She's been a close friend and comrade and very active too. They're in the place. And she also just recently ran in as a union candidate in local government elections last year in Victoria. So very important.
Jay, is there anything you want to plug? Do you have a YouTube or a show or a Twitter or
sure.
follow you?
You can go to my website. It's theorientaldespot.com. So that's what it's called. You can find me on Facebook. Just search my name as it's written here. I also have a YouTube channel, which you can also find on my Facebook. But check out my website. A lot of my articles are there.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well,
and there's the 2 talks on Yemen. So I'll post that on my Facebook wall now, so you can. Yeah, I mean, it's already on my Facebook wall, so just scroll down. I think it's the last post. And yeah, I'll be talking about Yemen tomorrow and the day after.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very
on.
much. Well, look, it's been a pleasure having you on with us, and it's good to hear your insight and things. Like, don't want to too much repeat what my dust said, but yeah, it was a lot more thorough, clear view of what's happening there around kind of India and the rest of the world and Australia. So look, thank you for your contribution. We truly appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Dust.
All right. We usually lead a chant to end it with. I've been leading it, and David's been doing it. Maybe we'll do it a little bit different. Hey, David, why don't you do Dare to Struggle, and then I'll do Dare to Win, and then you do all Power to the People.
Okay.
All right.
So so repeat after David's going to say something. We repeat, and then I'm going to say something. Everyone repeats, and then he's going to do it again. Let's try it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to struggle. Dare to win.
Dare to win.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.
All right. Good night, comrades.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
All right.